Beneath the caravan's silent lamps, I awaken to a desert night so vast and black it seems to breathe. The air shivers with coolness, carrying the faint tang of sand and the echo of hooves. I lie upon a thin mat, my head resting on a rolled cloth, yet sleep has already fled me. Tonight, the sky is an ocean of stars, each flickering point a lantern guiding the caravan across endless dunes. I sit up, rubbing the chill from my arms, and in the dark I taste both fear and wonder, woven together like threads in a tapestry. When I was but a boy in bulk, my home felt sturdy, brick walls baked by the sun, gardens heavy with pomegranates. Yet those walls, I now know, sheltered only the body, not the soul. The thundering of Mongol war drums tore through that illusion of safety, summoning us to move before the storm swallowed all. I was 13 then, clutching my father's hand as we fled by torchlight, the scent of smoke and terror trailing behind. My father, Bahawalid, whose gentle voice bore more authority than any sword, whispered as we rode through the moonlit dunes, "Jalal, remember that a soul is vaster than any city. If your city falls, you still carry home within you." Even then I felt the weight of those words settling into the hollow of my chest. Tonight, under these same skies, I recall that first lesson. The dunes around me roll like ocean waves frozen in time, their curves etched by winds older than memory. Each grain of sand shines faintly in starlight, as if the entire desert breathes with a pulse. My fingers trace idle patterns in the sand, and I feel the earth shift beneath my touch, a living thing, never stagnant. In this moment, resistance feels as futile as trying to halt the tides. Better, I think, to lean into motion, to let the world reshape me as the desert reshapes the sands. I stand and stretch, my cloak whispering against the ground. The other travelers sleep, merchants' wives curled around small pots of water, an aged dervish wrapped in a woolen shawl, a camel herder slumped by his camels, long necks swaying like reeds. They trust the lamp's glow and the sturdy camels to shield them. Yet I trust something more subtle, the inner light that flickers when ego dissolves, a light my father hinted at, and that I have only glimpsed since. Crackling wood guides my feet toward the campfire. Its embers glow red beneath blackened logs, smoke drifts upward in lazy spirals. I crouch and cup my hands around the coals, feeling heat seep through the spaces between my fingers. I breathe in the scent of oak and cedar, and in that moment, my pulse slows. I repeat silently, let the changes come. Let the winds carve these dunes. Let life live through me. The mantra feels good on my tongue, a benediction, a surrender rolled into a prayer. Far off, a jackal calls, a lone voice challenging the vast night. I close my eyes and imagine that call is not a cry of hunger or despair, but an invitation. Change is here, wild and unbidden. As the caravan prepares to rise with dawn's first light, I realize that I, too, must rise in spirit. My father taught me geometry and law, but the desert teaches something different. Impermanence is the only permanence. Every crest of sand will erode, shift, become something new. If I cling to memory or to comfort, I will break when the world changes. If I flow like sand, I will join the dance of the dunes. The moon high overhead dips behind a curtain of clouds, and stars wink out one by one. Darkness deepens. I walk nearer the edge of camp, where the dunes descend into shadows. The night wind brushes my cheek, cool as forgiveness. I feel the stirrings of a story within me, a story not of victory or defeat, but of surrender. It crackles like a flame, ready to leap. I think of the journey still ahead, the markets of Konya, the swirl of languages, the clash of beliefs. Each step will test my grip on certainty. Yet with each step, I will remind myself of the desert's lesson. Shape yourself to the world's turning, and discover that true strength is born in yielding. A shooting star blazes across the sky, a swift reminder of brevity. I lift my gaze, heart humming, and bow my head. There, in the silent promise of night, I vow to trust each moment's tide. The caravan's lamps may dwindle, but the inner lamp, the soul's lamp, burns bright. Let the dunes shift, let the world reshape these wandering feet. I will not resist change. I will become the desert song, carried on wind and whispered beneath silent lamps. I arrived in Konya as though stepping through a doorway from one world into another, a city woven of stone and song, where the morning light glinted off minarets like silver reeds bent by a breeze. The air was scented with mint and rosewater, and the corridors of the madrasa resonated with echoes of debate, the clash of tongues quoting fiqh, the measured cadence of Arabic exegesis, the rich Persian lilt of poetry woven through every utterance. Yet beneath the tapestry of learned discourse, I sensed a silent undercurrent, an invitation to dive deeper than the letter of the law, to listen for a music that lay hidden behind the scrolls and lectures. On my first day at the school, I entered the lecture hall to find a semicircle of young men, scrolls open before them, faces illuminated by shafts of sunlight. As I took my place in my father's former chair, the chair he had occupied when scholars came from distant lands to hear his judgments, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon my shoulders. This exalted seat was both honor and burden. To stand here was to carry the legacy of Baha Walid, whose reputation as Sultan of the Scholars had spread like warm incense. I cleared my throat, and the room hushed. Today, I began, my voice steady though my heart whispered a different tune. We examined the principles of Qiyas, analogical reasoning, and its application to a novel case of communal property. The students bent their heads, reeds to my current of logic, and so I unraveled the complexities, how jurists compare new scenarios to established precedents, how they weigh evidence, how they balance the needs of the community against individual rights. My words flowed in legal precision, each term defined, each inference justified. I could see nods in the audience, marginal notes scrawled in black ink, the faint sheen of reverence for tradition. When I finished, a deliberate silence held the hall. Then one young man raised his hand. "Master," he asked, "what of cases where precedent contradicts local custom? Which takes precedence, text or tradition?" I prepared the standard answer. In matters of custom, if it does not contradict clear scriptural injunctions, the local practice may be upheld, and recited the jurist's consensus. The student bowed his head, convinced. Yet as I watched him turn the page, I felt a tremor within me, as though a door had cracked open behind my stern voice. Over the following weeks, days blended into nights thick with ink and candle smoke. I presided over disputations, one merchant claiming water rights against another, a widow seeking dower after her husband's passing, a traveling dervish disputing a levy imposed by the city guard. Each case required careful parsing of texts, Quran, Hadith, the fatwas of earlier authorities. I would outline a proposition, cite opinions, Al-Shafi'i, Malik ibn Anas, Abu Hanifa, then weigh their arguments. Students leaned forward, absorbing each syllable as though it were manna. Yet in the quiet moments before dawn, when I slipped from the lecture hall to wander the tiled courtyards, I sensed something else stirring inside me. The fountain in the central courtyard murmured its ancient song, droplets dancing upon marble. Nightingales, unseen, trilled hymns to a moon I could just make out through clustered vines. And there, in the hush, I felt a restlessness, as though the law's firm walls were too brittle to contain the vast ocean of the soul. One morning, I found myself lingering by the library's entrance, where scrolls lined shelves in geometric perfection. Their leather spines gleamed with calligraphy. I ran my fingers along the titles, Tafsir al-Jalalain, al-Mawada, al-Qawanin al-Fiqhiyya, and an itch rose within me. These scrolls spoke of contracts and crimes, rites and rituals, but they did not speak of the trembling joy that fluttered in my chest when I watched a sparrow alight upon a rooftop. They did not define the fragrance of basil crushed between fingertips, nor the taste of sweet rain on an upturned tongue. As midday sun poured through latticed windows, I took a single scroll, one of my least read manuals of inheritance law, and walked past the students engrossed in their copying. I ascended narrow stone stairs to the rooftop terrace, where the city spread before me, clay rooftops, slender domes, the minarets of mosques like sentinels at prayer. I unrolled the scroll, but my eyes drifted from Arabic script to horizon. In the distance, wind tossed the branches of cypress trees, and the air trembled with the promise of afternoon breeze. I realized then that knowledge was more than accumulation of facts. It was the capacity to feel the world's pulse, to let each moment teach me something new. If I confined myself to the brackets of commentary and marginalia, I risked mistaking the map for the territory. I let the scroll slip from my hand. It fluttered and wound in the breeze before settling on cold stone. I closed my eyes and inhaled the scent of the city, dust and spice and cedar. Returning to the hall for the afternoon session, I felt lighter, as though a veil had lifted. When a student posed a question about tax exemptions, I answered with legal citations, then paused and asked, "But what of compassion? If the law uproots a man's livelihood, does it not wound the body of community, as surely as a thorn wounds the foot?" Some eyebrows rose. A few students glanced at one another uncertainly. I pressed on. The text grants discretion to the judge. Consider not only the letter, but the spirit. Let mercy temper justice. In that moment, I sensed the chamber breathe, walls expanding to accommodate a possibility they had never known. That night, I sat by a lantern in my quarters, writing a short treatise not of jurisprudence, but of living law. I wrote of the silent accord between the heart and the cosmos, of the need to translate scripture through the prism of kindness. My quill scratched fervently. I cited no authorities, referenced no canonical texts, yet each word felt pulled from a deeper well. When I read my lines aloud, the ink shimmered in the lantern's glow, as though on the verge of flight. Thus Konya became not merely a place of lecture and debate, but the fertile ground where a new garden of thought took root. Each morning's discourse laid the foundation of structure. Each evening solitude watered the seedlings of insight. Law taught me form, but the city's alleys, its markets, its whispering gardens taught me freedom. I learned to wear the robe of a jurist, yet harbor a dervish's heart, a heart that knew every syllable of a breeze could outsing the mightiest verdict. So I remained, by day, the scholar in structured argument, by night, the seeker tracing patterns in the stars. Between those hours, I sensed the contours of a revolution, not one waged by swords, but by words that crack open minds, and by silences that widen souls. In Konya's embrace, I discovered that true knowledge requires both book and breath, the script and the song woven into one unbroken tapestry. And so I listened, always listening, for the next voice that would call me beyond certainty, toward the ever-unfolding mystery that is life itself. I paused at the madrasa gate one sunlit afternoon, my sandals dusty from pacing its courtyard stones, and watched the world fold itself anew before my eyes. A bread seller, bent by age and, stood beneath a tattered awning, kneading dough with hands knotted like ancient tree roots. He sang as he worked, a simple folk tune, the notes rising and falling like waves against a rocky shore. I felt those notes drift through me, as though the melody had found a cleft in my armor, slipping inside to speak in a language no scripture could capture. The rhythm beckoned me closer, and I leaned against a carved column, my breath catching. Flour dust clung to the seller's beard, and sweat dampened his brow. His voice wove stories of harvest moons, of weddings lit by lanterns, of travelers who found refuge in a stranger's home. Each verse was an invitation to witness change as it unfolded, in dough transforming to bread, in seed blossoming to stalk, in silence blossoming to song. I realized then that truth might not lie in parchment and ink alone, but in the simple acts that shape our daily lives. My heart thrummed with recognition of something both ancient and immediate. Had I ever truly heard the world's music, or had I been deafened by the clamor of my own certainties? All my life I had sought permanence in law, binding rules, fixed categories, precedents etched in stone. Yet here was a truth that lived and breathed, impermanent and vital. Try not to resist the changes that come your way, the refrain whispered in my mind. Instead, let life live through you. I tasted those words like bittersweet wine, their meaning unfolding layer by layer, surrender as a vessel for transformation, openness as the seedbed of wisdom. The bread seller's hands moved with fluid certainty as he shaped loaves, scored each one with swift, deliberate cuts. Steam curled from the wood-fired oven behind him, softening the edges of the midday heat. I closed my eyes, inhaled the mingled scents of wheat and smoke, and felt the currents of change coursing through every pore of my being. The world was neither static nor chaotic. It was a living poem in motion, and I, so long accustomed to cataloging its nouns, was now invited to dance in its verbs. I approached him, heart pounding with the hesitancy of one stepping into a new realm. "May I taste your bread?" I asked, my voice sounding alien against the backdrop of my own expectations. He smiled, a slow unfolding that revealed decades of sun and wind. He gestured to a small wooden stool beside his tray. I sat, and he broke a warm loaf, its crumb tender beneath his fingers, and offered me a piece. The bread was fragrant, yielding to my bite and dissolving into warmth across my tongue. In that moment I understood, change, like bread, requires friction and heat. It needs time to rise, and patience to be savored. I sat with the seller while the sun arced overhead, and we spoke without speaking. His tune drifted anew, and I found myself humming along, the melody carving out spaces within me where doubt once lodged. I told him of my lectures, of the scrolls stacked in the courtyard, of the debates that echoed into evening. He nodded, flower dust swirling in his gestures, as if blessing my words with the dust of the earth. He replied with simple truths, that life flows like a river, never twice the same, that to grip the riverbank is to miss the current, that to be a vessel, one must be hollowed of resistance. As afternoon shadows slid across the stone floor, I rose and offered him a coin. He waved it away, dismissing the gesture with an unexpected gentleness. "Take the lesson with you," he said, voice soft yet unwavering. "Let the melody live through your hands as I let life live through mine." In that instant, I recognized the depth of his gift, not merely the words I carried away, but the way my spirit had shifted in his presence. I returned to the madrasa with new eyes. The carved columns no longer felt like prison bars. They were pillars supporting an ever-changing canopy of experience. The students who scribbled notes beneath lantern glow became fellow travelers in a grand, unfolding story. When I spoke of legal principles that evening, my voice held an extra cadence, an echo of the bread seller's song. I paused more often, allowing silence to breathe between my arguments, trusting that the space would carry its own insight. Word of my transformation spread through the corridors. Some scholars raised skeptical brows, others leaned forward, eager for the undercurrent they sensed but could not yet name. I invited them to step beyond scroll and lecture hall, to listen for the melodies woven through everyday acts. At first, they hesitated, bound by the gravity of tradition. But then, like the grain pressed beneath the baker's hands, they yielded, and the learning dough began to rise within them. I began to weave new exercises into my teaching, a morning walk through the rose garden, where we smelled petals and practiced silence, an afternoon gathering beneath the cypress trees, where each student hummed a note and listened for how their voices blended into the wind. We wrote verses not to dissect them, but to feel how words rippled through the soul. I urged them to resist the urge to pin down truth like a butterfly in a case. Instead, I asked them to become butterflies themselves, wings tasting the air. In my journal that night, I wrote, "Change arrives as bread, as breath, as song. To resist it is to hunger in the presence of plenty. Instead, let the world reshape you until your heart beats in time with its hidden harmonies." The words glowed on the page, alive and pulsing. I pressed my palm to the parchment, as though transferring the lesson itself into my flesh. From that day forward, every moment became an opportunity to practice surrender. When a student challenged a ruling, I listened for the melody behind his challenge. When a disciple wept over a personal loss, I offered comfort not through doctrine alone but through presence, standing with him in shared change. In each encounter I sought the bread seller's song, the thread that binds law to life, structure to spontaneity. And always, I returned in memory to that simple awning, to the kneading hands, to the folk tune rising into the desert air. The lesson had taken root. Resistance is the door that locks the heart, surrender is the key that opens it. I learned then that wisdom flows not from rulings imposed, but from living truths received. The melody lives through each breath, each footstep, each unfolding moment, and in letting it live through me, I discovered the boundless terrain of change itself. I entered my study on an autumn morning that shimmered with a promise of upheaval. The lamps were still alight, their amber glow softening the scroll-lined walls into curves of gold and shadow. I paused at the threshold, feeling a ripple in the air as though truth itself breathed beside me. On the low divan, Shams of Tabriz sat cross-legged, his robe the color of midnight, his eyes two ever-burning coals. He looked up from the cup of coffee he cradled, and the world tilted on its axis. His gaze held no judgment, only an invitation. I swallowed the familiar knot of propriety tightening my chest and offered him the courtesy of a scholar's greeting, yet my tongue faltered. This was no mere man but a flame in human guise, a paradox wrapped in questions. He beckoned silently, and I stepped forward until our knees nearly touched. In that instant, I sensed the foundation of my world, my certainties, my careful orderings, quiver as if struck by a sudden wind. "Who are you?" I asked, striving to anchor myself in words. Shams smiled, the corners of his mouth as sharp as a scimitar's edge. "The question is, who am I to you?" he replied, voice low and resonant. Those words fell like stones into the still water of my heart, sending concentric circles of wonder outward. He had not answered at all, yet he had laid bare every assumption I'd ever made about identity, about self. My breath caught. I had built my life upon definitions, my name, my lineage, my learning. Yet here was an encounter that defied categories. In those depths of his gaze, I glimpsed a freedom I had never known, the looseness of being unbound by roles. My voice, when it came, was smaller than a whisper. "I am Jalal," I said, "a teacher, a son, a seeker." He inclined his head. "Let us set aside these names," he murmured, "and see what remains." He pushed aside the coffee cup, its porcelain clink echoed like a bell tolling the end of my old life. I felt the ground shift beneath me, no longer stable, but alive with possibilities. I tried to rise, to retreat to the safety of scholarship, but my limbs refused. Instead, I sank lower, mirroring his posture on the floor. Between us lay nothing but air, no scrolls, no lecterns, no audience. The afternoon sun wove ribbons of light across the carpet, illuminating dust motes that waltzed like celestial dancers. He placed a hand on the floor and asked, "Do you know the sound of silence?" Silence, an ordinary absence that I had long mistaken for emptiness, suddenly sounded like thunder. I felt my ears strain to hear its voice, a humming stillness that spoke of galaxies in quantum hush. My mind, for the first time, stilled. All at once, the distinctions between teacher and student dissolved. There was only the two of us and the vastness in our midst. We spoke then without words. I saw questions unspoken swirl in his eyes. I felt answers rising in my chest, answers that could not be preserved in ink. He leaned forward as though to pass these currents of knowing into my blood. I felt a warmth flood through me, a joyous tremor that made my bones quake. It was as if every teaching I had ever given had built a fortress around my own spirit, and a single glance had blown its gates wide open. Time lost meaning. An hour might have passed, or a single heartbeat. When I dared to blink, Shams had vanished. No trace remained but the tremor in my hands, the drumbeat in my throat. I staggered to my feet, bewildered, my world rearranged. My silent chamber felt suddenly crowded, with stars, with questions, with an infinite invitation. In the days that followed, I found my lecture manuscripts unreadable. The elegant logic I once prized now seemed brittle, inadequate to hold the vastness I had glimpsed. I attempted to teach as before, and my tongue tied itself in doubt. Students watched me with concern as I paused mid-sentence, eyes raised as though I sought some new horizon beyond the walls. At night, I tried to recall the precise words of our encounter, but there were none. Instead, I remembered the echo of presence, the vibration of a question that trespassed on every certainty. I realized that change sometimes arrives in the guise of a beggar, unassuming, ragged, yet carries within it a sultan's treasury. In Sham's silence, I heard the music of the spheres. In his absence, I felt his presence more keenly than any human voice. I began to wander the streets of Konya at dawn, not as a jurist with scroll in hand, but as a seeker of that elusive remainder beyond name and form. I traced the old city walls with my fingers, hallowed by centuries of prayers. I offered bread to beggars without judgment, listening to their stories as though each were a verse in an unfolding poem. I sat by the fountain that had witnessed countless departures, and I poured out my questions like water, only to discover that the fountain's reply was a reflection of my own longing. Behind every question I now sensed another question, and each answer revealed another threshold. I wrote my lectures on new pages, lectures no scholar had heard. I spoke of emptiness not as void, but as the fertile ground from which every possibility sprouts. I spoke of names not as cages, but as flowers whose petals open onto the infinite sun. My students listened, some rapt, others puzzled, but all aware that a current ran beneath my words, a river born of that silent communion. In the hush before sunrise, I would light a single lamp in my chamber and chant a verse I had composed. Let the lantern of reason rest, that the flame of wonder may dance free. I felt the heat of that flame within my chest, and I knew I was no longer the man I had been. The fortress of certainty lay in ruins, and in its rubble sprouted the green shoot of transformation. Each day I embraced the shifting wind inside me, trusting that life would live through these tremors as it lived through the desert sands beneath silent lamps. Thus did the meeting with Shams rend the tapestry of my old self, revealing the golden thread of surrender. And from that day forth, I carried his paradox in my blood. The question is not who you are, but who you may become when you yield to the fierce mercy of change. On the dawn of our retreat, I slipped away from Konya's murmuring streets and entered a grove of ancient cypresses whose trunks rose like silent columns to the sky. There, Shams me under a canopy of dappled light. His eyes glowed with a purpose I could not yet name. No word passed between us, only the knowing nod that heralded our 40 days together, stripped of parchment and discourse. As I laid aside my robe of scholarship and sat upon the fallen needles of the forest floor, I felt the first crack in my old self, as if a great kiln was stoking its embers deep within. He began with nothing, a breath, a glance, the quiet swirl of leaves. There were no lectures, no scrolls, only questions hurled into the emptiness like meteorites seeking impact. Where does the flame go when the candle is blown out? He asked at twilight, and I opened my mouth, ready to recite some pat answer from hadith or geometry, but found only stunned silence. At that moment, I realized I had lived marinated in definitions, and that my words had become brittle shields against the unknown. Each day unfolded as a ceremony of unlearning. We walked barefoot upon dew-slick grass while he asked, "What color is the breeze?" I chased the absurdity of the question, bending to trace invisible currents upon my palm, only to discover that breeze has no color yet paints itself upon our skin. I tasted that realization like honey, not sweet, but deep and strange. With each riddle, the mortar of my convictions cracked, and a fresher, more pliant mind emerged from the fissures. By the fifth morning, the rising sun found me stripped of my starched collars and scented oils. Shams and I faced one another in a clearing, the ground strewn with petals from an overhanging wild rose. He pressed a single petal into my hand and commanded me to tell him its secret. I studied its curve, its downy veins, its exquisite imperfection, and I saw not a flower but a universe. My answer stumbled out in a whisper, "It opens, and in doing so it surrenders to whatever will come." He smiled, and the grove exhaled as if in relief. The nights were harder. Under a sky brighter than any candle, I scrabbled for the safety of doctrine. When Shams fell silent, I reached for memory. Had I not ruled on inheritance? Had I not adjudicated countless disputes? Could I not summon a precedent for my trembling heart? But the night would not yield. Each star was a question, each gust of wind a summons to drift. I learned then that absence can be a forge. In the emptiness of answers, the soul is shaped by fire. One day, perhaps the 23rd, Shams led me to a river swollen with spring melt. He disrobed without ceremony and waded into the current, beckoning me to follow. I hesitated at the bank, clutching the fabric of my robe as though it were the last tether to the man I had been. Then the river spoke. Here is surrender, here is transformation. I stepped in. The water closed over my waist, then my chest, cool as clarity itself. Each step downstream was a stroke against the inertia of self. When I emerged, dripping and unadorned, Shams pressed water into my cupped palms and said, "Drink. Let the river live through you." In the days that followed, I tasted the world as though each moment were my first, the tang of iron in the riverbank soil, the laughter of a boy chasing a homebound goat, the smoky perfume of evening fires. Without words, I learned more than I ever had in lecture halls. I came to see that truth is not an edifice to be built but a current to be entered. On the 40th dawn, when the horizon blushed pink, I awoke to find my cloak gone. In its place lay a single white feather upon my chest. I understood then that the scholar I had been had found wings. I rose, heart buoyant, and followed Shams into the grove. There he stood amid a ring of cypresses, sunlight painting him gold. He looked upon me as a mother looks upon a freed child. "Now," he said simply, "you are ready." I felt tears, though no sorrow lay in them, only the joy of becoming. My old self, the stern jurist, lay consumed in that crucible of questions. From the ashes rose a lover of mystery, a vessel open to the world's breath. When I bowed to Shams, it was not deference alone but gratitude, for he had shown me that the fiercest fire is the one that forges the heart into an instrument of surrender. And so I emerged from our 40 days of fire, not with new doctrines to teach, but with a soul aflame, and with a single vow, never again to resist the changes that come my way, but to let life live through me. Under the weight of winter's hush, I rose before the city stirred. My breath hung in the cold air as I stepped into the courtyard where the cypresses threw long shadows across frost-cred stones. Since Shams vanished, snatched away as though he had never breathed beside me, the world felt hollowed, its music stolen. I carried that emptiness like a stone in my chest, pressing against every breath. No dawn chorus reached my ears, no rustle of sandals on the madrasa's tiles brought comfort. Instead, each stir of wind seemed to whisper only loss. I wandered through Konya's narrow lanes, searching faces for a glimmer of him. I asked merchants about a dervish in black, but they shrugged, returning to their trading. I questioned travelers in tea houses, but they offered only polite condolences. My own voice, once clear and resonant in lecture halls, felt lost in my throat. Where had he gone? Had fate's dagger found him? Or had he chosen exile, abandoning me to the scaffolding of my old self? Doubt gnawed at the edges of my courage. By midday, I found myself at the banks of the river that wound through the city like a silver thread. I knelt by its edge and let my fingers touch the water's glassy surface. It flowed on, heedless of my grief, an eternal current unmoved by mortal sorrow. Yet in its endless motion, I sensed a kindred lesson: absence is part of life's river. I cupped water in my palms and let it slip through my fingers, each drop a reminder that what once filled my world may slip away, yet the river endures. In that moment, I felt the first flicker of a question more profound than loss. What if this emptiness were not a wound alone, but an invitation? What if absence itself could be the forge of transformation? I rose and traced the river's course until I reached the ancient bridge where Shams and I once stood in silence, marveling at shadows dancing on water. I placed my hand on the cool stone and closed my eyes, recalling his gaze, fierce, unyielding, yet full of compassion. I whispered into the wind, "Teach me, even in your absence." When I opened my eyes, I noticed a tattered piece of cloth snagged on the bridge's railing, a scrap of black wool that could only have been his. It trembled in the breeze like a flag marking a battlefield of the heart. I pulled it free and pressed it to my lips, tasting fibers woven with memory. My tears mingled with the thread, and in their salty mingling, I vowed not to let this loss bury me in despair. From that day, I walked the city as both pilgrim and poet. Where once I lectured on law, I now sought the law written by sorrow. I visited the orphans' courtyard and offered them bread, recalling how Shams taught me that mercy is action's quiet breath. I sat with widows in their walled gardens, learning how grief, like soil, can harbor seeds of paradoxical growth. I perched on stony rooftops, tracing the flight of pigeons and listening for his steps that would not return, but which I could summon within my own stride. In my private chamber, I unearthed the pen once used for legal treatises and began scribbling verses of longing. Each line carried the echo of his questions. Where does absence dwell? How does a heart learn new rhythms when its drumbeat is silenced? My ink poured like prayer, and the pages filled with laments that slowly crystallized into hymns. I discovered that absence had opened a space inside me so vast that the One himself might dwell there. In that emptiness I heard a deeper voice than any I had known amid scrolls and sermons, a voice that sang of unity beyond form. One quiet night, I dreamt of Shams perched atop a cedar branch, his silhouette wreathed in moonlight. He looked at me and spoke without sound, his lips curved in promise. I awoke gasping, my heart alight, for I knew that though he walked the unseen realm, his spirit remained the flame at my core. I rose and lit a single lamp in the darkness, watching its glow shimmer upon my written verses. In that glow, absence itself took on a new hue, not emptiness, but the crucible in which love refines the soul. In the weeks that followed, disciples noticed a change in my presence. The stern judge had become a mourner whose eyes held both sorrow and solace. When they approached me with questions of doctrine, I answered with parables drawn from our shared sorrow. I spoke of absence as midwife to deeper awareness, of wounds as gateways to tenderness. Some listened in wonder, others wept at the resonance of their own losses laid bare by my words. At times, the ache threatened to overwhelm me, an ocean tide that dragged me beneath its surface. Yet each wave taught me its lesson, yield to its pull, and discover the strength to rise again. In that yielding, I became like the reed by the river, hollow within, so that the wind might pass and transform its voice into melody. One winter's dawn, as a thin veil of frost glazed the courtyard, I gathered my scribes and read aloud the verses born of this time. I felt Shams beside me in every breath, not as flesh and bone, but as the abiding spark of inquiry and grace. My words traced arches of hope across the cold air, each syllable a testament to absence transmuted into poem, into prayer, into prayerful song. And so I paved my sorrow into guidance for all who, like me, have known loss. I taught that absence is no final defeat, but the still point around which new creation spins. Even in grief, life insists on weaving itself anew. In letting absence live through me, I found myself reborn as both lover and guide, carrying Shams within, not in sight, but in every silent question that breathes between heartbeats. Beneath the vault of dawn's first light, I stood alone in the courtyard where the cypress trees flanked the open sky, their dark fingers pointed toward heaven. The air was cool and, as if the world held its breath in anticipation. In that hush, I felt a stirring deep within my chest, a trembling seed of motion that called to be released. My robe, heavy with the memory of scholarship, slipped from my shoulders, and I let it cool around my feet like a discarded veil. The stone beneath me, worn smooth by the sandals of seekers, felt alive, humming with the footsteps of every pilgrim who had ever traced this ground. I closed my eyes and placed my hands upon my heart, and there, in that silence, I heard the faintest echo of a pulse not my own, the distant turning of the spheres. When I opened my eyes, the courtyard had become a stage. The cypresses bowed overhead like silent witnesses. I inhaled deeply, drawing in the fragrance of cedar and sage, and lifted my arms, palms open to the sky. The rhythm began as a whisper in my bones, a heartbeat speeding in time with the wind. My right foot stepped forward, then the left, and soon I was circling, slowly at first, as though testing the ground, each rotation a soft hymn of gratitude and release. My eyes remained half-closed, gazing inward, where the flame of longing burned steadily, guiding each turn. The world around me blurred, the cypress trunks, the latticework of shadows, the pale glow of the rising sun, everything merged into a single, living tapestry. My robe, once heavy, ballooned around me like a blossom in bloom, and I felt my center grow light, freed from ballast and fear. With every revolution, I whispered the words I had learned beneath desert stars, "Let life live through me." And as those words echoed in my mind, they unlocked something precious, something alive, the realization that motion is prayer made visible. I felt the rhythm deepen, my body pulled by an invisible current. Where before I had sought stillness in contemplation, now I found silence in movement. The creak of timber doors opening, the distant chatter of dawn preparations in the madrasa, these sounds faded into a quiet backdrop, the courtyard my universe. My spine became the spindle, my arms the spokes, and my feet traced circles that spun the world inside me. Each turn peeled away a layer of hesitation, fear of judgment, fear of failure, even the subtle fear of ecstasy. In its place rose trust, trust in the breath that carried me, in the ground that held me, in the one who whirls through every atom of creation. As I spun, I felt a presence gather at the edges of the courtyard, first a curious shadow, then a few disciples drawn by the whisper of a miracle in motion. They stood at the perimeter, eyes wide, uncertain whether to interrupt or join. I could feel their longing, the same longing that had awakened within me years before when I heard the distant call of a folk tune beneath a tattered awning. Now I offered them this new song, a dance of surrender, where every spin was a verse, every footstep a stanza. I sped up, the morning light flashing between my rotating limbs, and the courtyard itself seemed to breathe in time with me. My hair, loosened from its coil, flared outward, a halo of motion. Sweat beaded on my brow, but I felt no fatigue. Instead, energy poured in from the earth below and the sky above, an unspoken covenant between self and cosmos. I understood, in that rapture, that true revolution begins within. The world shifts, not because we conquer it, but because we allow our own center to move. When at last I slowed, my rotations easing like ripples fading upon water, I knelt on the cool stone, hands pressed to the ground. My breath came in deep, joyous gasps. Silence returned, but it was richer now, threaded with the echoes of wings and wheels, of stars spinning in the night. My disciples approached, one by one, their faces alight with wonder and trembling excitement. I rose and placed my hand on each shoulder, offering no words, for silence carried the grace they sought. In the days that followed, we gathered each dawn beneath the cypresses. I taught them not through lectures but through turning, how to find their axis, how to release the longing of the heart into the movement of the limbs, how to hear the music of life in the beating of their own pulse. Some fell, dizzy and laughing, others wept at the unfamiliar freedom in their chests. All were reborn piece by piece, learning that change is the very breath of existence and that to resist motion is to resist the soul. Thus the whirling began, a dance without end, each circle a continuation of the circle that birthed the cosmos. And in each turn, we honored the invitation first whispered to me beneath a tattered awning, then magnified in a grove of question and fire, and finally made manifest in the silent cathedral of this courtyard. We did not seek perfection in our whirls, only truth. And in the spinning, in the letting go, we found that the world could live through us, as we had learned to let life live through our every breath, our every sigh, our every sacred turn. I rode into the city before dawn, the muezzin's call still echoing faintly through narrow alleys slick with morning dew. Konya's walls gleamed pale gold in the first, and already the streets swelled with strangers, refugees of spirit who carried burdens heavier than any caravan's cargo. They came from distant towns scarred by war, small villages undone by drought, even from lands beyond the sea where faiths collided and promises withered. Among them were scholars whose libraries lay in ashes, merchants whose ledgers had turned to cinders, mothers clasping infants born beneath broken roofs. Their eyes held the same question: how shall we rebuild when every certainty has crumbled? I dismounted at the edge of the grand square, where 12 pillars formed a silent ring around an ancient plane tree. Beneath its wide canopy, I found a gathering: Jewish travelers draped in wool, Christian pilgrims in tattered tunics, Zoroastrians whose fire had dimmed, local peasants who'd walked for days clutching nothing but a loaf of bread. They sat on rugs laid upon the stones, faces shadowed with fatigue and fear. I sensed their longing for hope, for a refuge that no fortress could provide. I tethered my camel and stepped among them, not as a judge but as a fellow wayfarer whose own path had been forged in exile of the heart. Yesterday I was clever and tried to change the world, I began, my voice soft against the hush. Today I am wise and change myself. The word surprised even me, born of the shifts in my own soul since Sham's departure. A hush fell deeper, and I saw in their eyes the spark of recognition. They knew the ache of striving against storms. They knew dust in their throats and tears they could not shed. I settled cross-legged upon the earth, inviting them to lean forward, to close the distance that law and custom had once insisted upon. I told them of a time when I clung to scholarship as though it were a shield, believing that rulings and precedents could bind the unruliest winds. But I had learned, amid the spinning whirls and the desert's hush, that true refuge arises not from walls but from the heart that turns inward and finds the flame of compassion. Build a sanctuary within, I urged, one that no calamity can breach. I watched mothers draw their children closer, watched young men uncurl tense shoulders. The simple act of inhaling a breath together wove a fragile bond among us. We spoke then of loss, the loss of homes, of loved ones, of livelihoods. One man, his beard streaked with gray, rose and recounted how the river that once nourished his village had run dry, taking with it half his kin. A widow wept quietly, describing how the invaders had seized her lands and left her fields fallow. I listened without offering legal solutions, for no decree could raise a blade of wheat where drought held sway. Instead, I asked them to feel their own sorrow fully, to let it open their hearts as a seed cracks to thrust its shoot toward the sun. Sorrow, I said, is the lantern that shows us where love still dwells. At midday, a breeze stirred beneath the plane tree, and I invited them all to rise and walk with me through the neighboring gardens. There, almond trees bloomed, petals drifting like pale snowflakes across narrow paths. See how the blossoms surrender to the wind, I whispered. They do not resist their fall, they trust that even in falling, they become the soil's promise. As we walked, I guided each refugee to press a hand to the bark of an old olive tree, to feel its slow pulse beneath rough skin. Let the earth teach you steadiness, I said. Root yourself in what remains alive within you. When we returned to the square, I unfurled strips of cloth and offered them ink and reed pens. Write a vow to yourself, I instructed. Not of conquest, but of kindness. Some hesitated, as though unused to making promises not to rulers but to their own hearts. Then a merchant dipped his pen and wrote, I will offer water to the thirsty, even if my own cup runs low. A Christian monk scribbled, I will forgive the oppressor, so that my spirit may breathe free. A Zoroastrian elder paused before writing, I will fan the dying spark of faith until it blazes anew. Each vow glowed upon the cloth like a flame kindled in the dusk. As evening fell, lamps were lit around the plane tree. I sat among them, sharing bread and olives from my own pack, breaking first a loaf for each traveler before tearing my own portion. The act felt sacred, the simplest gesture of solidarity, yet it carried more hope than 100 fatwas. Faces softened in the warm lamplight, strangers became companions. We wove stories of past joys and of future dreams, and in that tapestry of voices, I glimpsed the seed of a new community, one not defined by creed or creed's boundary, but by the shared pulse of resilience. Before departing, I offered each traveler a small pouch of salt and a handful of seeds, salt, to remind them that life's flavor comes not despite hardship but through it, seeds, to remind them that faith, like grain, germinates in the darkness beneath the surface. Plant them where you go, I told them. And as they grow, may your hearts grow too, in compassion, in courage, in unity. They took the gifts with tears and smiles intermingled, pressing them against their chests as though holding the world's promise. When the square finally emptied, I remained by the plane tree, watching lamplight flicker against rough bark. I felt the echo of their footsteps fade, yet their vows lingered like footprints in my soul. I understood then that teaching refugees of spirit is not an act of instruction but an invitation to share suffering until it bends towards solidarity, to break bread until strangers taste kinship, to plant seeds until hope blooms in every heart. I rose and placed my hand upon the plane tree's trunk, whispering a prayer of gratitude for each weary pilgrim who had found a moment's refuge here. Then I melted into the shadows of Konya's lantern-lit streets, my own heart lighter, my own spirit renewed, knowing that change does not belong to the scholar or the sultan alone, but to every soul willing to surrender, to grow, and to let life live through them. On a morning softened by the first threads of dawn, I awoke to the unfamiliar weight of my own body. My beard, once dark as walnut, now bore threads of silver that glinted in lamplight like moonbeams caught in river reeds. A gentle ache coiled through my limbs, as though each joint remembered the countless whirls and wanderings it had carried me through. Where had the boundless energy of youth gone, the hunger to chase every star across memory's sky? I rose slowly, pressing a hand to my chest, feeling the steady labor of breath, each inhale a gift, each exhale a reminder that life still lived through me. The courtyard lay hushed beneath a pale mist. Gone were the eager students waiting to debate law's fine points or to learn the secrets of the Sema. Even the cypress trees seemed quieter, their branches stooped with age's own dignity. As I stepped onto the dew-laced stones, I felt the years press against my shoulders, not as burden alone, but as testament. Every line upon my face, every tremor in my fingers, bore witness to the paths I had walked, the souls I had touched, the prayers I had breathed. I paused beneath the plane tree where once I had gathered seekers from every faith. Its bark, furrowed now with deeper wrinkles, mirrored my own transformation, proof that time, like wind and water, shapes all things. A distant call to prayer drifted through the crisp air, and I closed my eyes to receive each syllable as though it were a caress upon my spirit. Where before I had rushed to occupy the lecturer's chair, eager to share the clarity I had found, now I felt a different calling, to embody the serenity that comes when one has learned to let go. I moved to the edge of the courtyard and seated myself on the cool marble, folding my robes around me like the petals of a late-blooming flower. I watched a single leaf tremble and drift to earth, an unspoken sermon on surrender. Pain came then, a subtle ache beneath my ribs that made each breath a negotiation between body and soul. For years, I had danced with ecstasy, spun in circles until the world became a tapestry of motion. I had poured my heart into verses and counseled refugees of spirit beneath lamplit skies. I had chased absence and found my own reflection in its hollow promise. Yet illness spoke a new truth, that even the beloved temple of flesh must one day yield to change's final decree. In the tender clasp of pain, I discovered compassion's deep well, compassion not only for others' suffering but for my own fragile vessel. I thought of the students who once flocked to my lessons, hungering for guidance, and realized that the teacher I had been would soon be replaced by another. A pang of longing stirred in me, longing not for position, but for the chance to whisper once more the words that had ignited so many hearts. How do you know the side you are used to is better than the one to come? I smiled through the ache, for I knew that in this season of my life, the question was not one to ask of others, but to offer myself as living proof. When the familiar world shifts, when limbs no longer obey the mind's commands, we find new ways to inhabit each moment. Day by day, I learned to listen to the subtle rhythms of my weakening body. I paced the halls more slowly, each step a meditation. When dizziness spun its own Sema within my head, I let myself sway gently instead of resisting, discovering that even imbalance has its own grace. My quill, once nimble and swift, now trembled in my grasp, so I let lines of verse settle onto the page like autumn leaves, each one savored rather than rushed. I dictated poetry to a trusted scribe, guiding each word with the gentleness a mother uses to hush her child to sleep. In this, I found a new power, the power of yielding, of accepting assistance, of trusting that surrender can be as profound as wielding authority. Visitors came, disciples turned elders themselves, bringing the warmth of loyalty and the soft inquiries of concern. They tended the lamp so that I would not strain my eyes, carried water for my parched throat, offered comfort with low, reverent bows. I received each gesture as a mirror reflecting the mercy I had once poured out in turn. In their caring, I glimpsed the continuity of the human chain, teacher and student, giver and receiver, life and death, all woven into one tapestry that transcends the mortal frame. Each afternoon, when the sun slanted golden through latticed windows, would rise and make my way to the rooftop terrace. There, overlooking the red-tiled roofs of Konya, I gazed upon the horizon and felt both a farewell and a greeting. I whispered to the sky, "I am arriving, not leaving," echoing the words I had once spoken of union with the beloved. For in each moment of decline, there is also the promise of transformation, a metamorphosis not of flesh, but of spirit. The veil between here and beyond draws thin, and I sense the next great Sema awaiting my feet. On nights when fever's fire raged within me, I prayed through the haze, recounting each breath as a bead on the rosary of gratitude. I offered thanks for every step taken in my youth, every heart opened, every tear shed in communion with another's pain. In the furnace of illness, I was refined once more, my ego smoldered away, my longing distilled into pure devotion. I understood that surrender is not defeat, but the final victory of love, love that cannot be constrained by mortality. When my final hour drew near, when breath grew shallow and lamps burned low, I felt the caravan of life kneel beside me. Friends and disciples gathered, their faces blurred by tears yet shining with compassion's light. I lifted a trembling hand in benediction, murmuring, "Do not mourn, I am arriving." And as the world slipped into the hush of dawn, I embraced the ultimate change, letting life live through these last flickers of awareness. My body fell away, but the soul's lamp, fanned by every moment of surrender, every verse written, every dance spun, blazed on, joining the eternal Sema spun by the one whose breath gives form to every change. On the morning of my union with the beloved, the horizon blazed like a door opening in flame. I awoke beneath the silken canopy of dawn, my body light as ember coal, my breath a whisper of incense. The air felt charged with 1,000 unseen presences, angels at the threshold, petals of light drifting on currents of longing. I rose from my mat, every joint humming with the music of parting, every sinew attuned to the final movement of life's grand dance. I stepped barefoot into the courtyard, where the marble floor still held the imprint of 100,000 footsteps, seekers who had come seeking guidance, disciples who had followed my whirling song. Today, their echoes seemed to call me home. The plane tree stood sentinel, its leaves murmuring blessings in the wind. I placed my hand upon its bark, feeling its pulse beat in harmony with my own. "This is Shebai Aruz," I whispered, naming the wedding night that awaited me. "Tonight I marry eternity." Disciples clustered at the edges of the courtyard, faces pale with awe and grief. They dared not speak, for words would shatter the fragile radiance of this hour. I saw tears glisten in their eyes, tears for the teacher they would lose, and yet also tears of joy for the soul about to be wedded to boundless life. I smiled, though my lips trembled, and beckoned them closer. "Do not mourn," I said, voice soft as rose petals falling. "I am arriving, not leaving." The sun rose slowly, pouring molten gold across the walls. I walked among my companions, touching each brow with a blessing. I recalled every moment we had shared, the first spark of wonder beneath the caravan's lamps, the tremor of transformation in the desert, the fierce gaze of Shams, the whirl of the Sema, the forge of absence, the hush of illness. Each memory shone now as a precious bead on the necklace of my life. I offered them silk scarves, tokens dyed in the colors of dawn, and told them to wear these as reminders, that every ending is but a beginning in new splendor. As the circle of light expanded, I found myself drawn to the center of the courtyard. There I came to stand before a single lamp, its flame steady and serene. I knelt, placing my forehead on the cool stone, and inhaled the perfume of jasmine that drifted from the garden. My heart swelled with gratitude, for every trial that taught me surrender, for every joy that revealed the beloved's face, for every breath that carried me closer to this moment. I whispered my wedding vows. I surrender myself, I open my heart, I become the cup you pour into, the reed you awaken to your melody. The lamp's flame leaped in answer, as if dancing to the echo of my vow. I rose, arms outstretched, and felt the courtyard dissolve in light. Time unraveled its thread, past and future wove into a single continuum of presence. I saw the face of every soul I had touched, their joys and tears reflecting back the facets of my own becoming. Love's tapestry shimmered in the glow, each thread a life transformed by surrender. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of rose and sandalwood. I closed my eyes and let the wind lift me, as though I were a feather released. My cloak slipped away, revealing the pure whiteness beneath, my soul unveiled in naked devotion. In that moment, form fell away. I became neither teacher nor seeker, neither flesh nor thought, but pure longing embodied, a portal through which the beloved's presence flowed. I felt my final breath gather in my chest, bright as a star about to burst. I lifted it to my lips as a final benediction and exhaled into the waiting silence. The courtyard, the disciples, the lamp, all shimmered and then were no more, absorbed into a singular pulse of love. I knew then that I was not departing but joining the eternal Sema, the dance that spins unseen yet holds all worlds in its revolving arms. And as the veil lifted, I spoke no words. Instead, my heart sang the only song that remains when self dissolves, a song of unity, of boundless joy, of the lover's triumphant return. In that ineffable glow, the story did not end. It poured forth into every beating heart that remembered to whirl, to write, to weep, to laugh. For the wedding night is not a solitary moment but an everlasting dawn, where every soul weds eternity and becomes the flame that lights the world.